Hey, folks, glad that you're able to join today. We've got a really special treat. We have Derek Snook here today. He is the author of a book entitled The Definition of Success. I had the opportunity to read the book, and it is fantastic. And I'm really excited that Derek took the time out of his day to come and to answer a couple of questions that we have about, just digging into the book.
So for listeners who aren't aware, I mean, I spent this year living at the Star Gospel Mission, just a dorm room with 26 beds. Every bed had a locker, and it was 7 years ago at this point, maybe 8. And what I learned is that the success that we're taught, if it oftentimes leads to self-absorption, isolation, and stress, the success that we want was taught to me through these men. It was mostly men that I interacted with who were homeless. And I realized in time that the success that we want is a life of purpose that leads to self-abandonment, community, and having a guide.
I was taking a look in the book, and there was one quote that I was especially intrigued by. In the book, it says, "I learned that success is the ongoing process of 3 distorting and misleading ingredients. The first is self-preservation or self-help. The second is isolation. And the third is stressfully guiding ourselves through culture-driven plans for our lives." And so I was especially intrigued by that, particularly the part where you're talking about isolation. We know that Jesus would go into isolation during various times whenever he was, before he would go out and perform miracles and preach. And so I was just wondering, did you see any connection between your reference to isolation as one of the ingredients to success and the way that Jesus would operate?
No. When I'm talking about isolation, I mean more of just the lack of human connection that Americans are suffering from more and more. The United Kingdom just last 2 weeks ago, they appointed a minister of loneliness because
Oh, wow.
isolation for their population is such a big deal. And of course, when you're not around your neighbors, you trust them less.
Right.
And so I think a lot of polarization in this country right now, racially, socioeconomically, politically, philosophically, in part stems from isolation. The less people are around who are different from you, the less you trust them.
You talked about Walter, if you will. Walter had, lost his wife. He had lost his child. He had a job at the church, a prevalent job at the church. He lost a job at the church. And then what was most interesting about your interaction with Walter was that when you asked, what do homeless folks need, right? What do homeless folks need? And he says, all anyone really needs is hope.
I expected him to say a nice job, a nice home, a solid education. And when he said hope, that held a mirror up to my own life in a way that was really uncomfortable, but really meaningful, because it suddenly made me wonder why I'd spent my entire life, instead of pursuing hope as a first thing,
right,
I was really spending my life pursuing a good job, a nice home, and a solid education.
Right.
And that was a big problem to what I thought about success in life.
We find ourselves, so consumed, right, with, day to day, right, the career, the kids, the wife, and we forget that at the core of it all, at the core of what we really need every single day is the love and the hope that's provided to us through Jesus Christ. And I think that's a really, really critical message that you were able to get from Walter when he said that. So I was intrigued by a series of questions. You talked about a series of questions that were swirling around your head as you were preparing to go to Good Samaritan, to the homeless shelter, to live for a year. What if I get sick? What if I'm attacked physically? What if there are drugs? And I was especially intrigued by that line of questioning because I went through the same train of thought when I first decided to start volunteering over at Urban Ministries. And so that got me thinking, perhaps that initial fear, right? Perhaps that those what if questions are a manifestation of the process of moving from fear to faith, right? And so just give me your perspective on that in terms of, the process of going from fear to faith and how you were able to experience that process through your journey.
Yeah. So I think in one sense, you could say that this is what life is all about, because I have not solved this problem. I still live in it constantly. And I think that faith is kind of every time you take a step, you realize there's a million more steps than you thought.
Right.
And we won't fully realize that until we meet Christ face to face. But for me, I think that those fears are indicators a lot of times of the directions that we're supposed to go, and it requires a lot of trembling. But when you look at people in life who have something meaningful to say, Jesus would say, "No one can take my life from me because I lay it down voluntarily." Like, he was comfortable with those fears and moving into them anyways. MLK would always say, if you don't have something that's worth dying for, you don't have something that's worth living for.
Right.
I think that being able to live that way is a critical challenge that's part of being human.
In the book, you also talk about fear of hell. All right. And that being a major factor in your early declaration and your faith in Christ.
Right.
And so I guess I was wondering, as I read that, at what point did that initial experience kind of transition into a deeper relationship with Christ, where you no longer were choosing Christ out of fear, but instead out of love?
I'm the son of a Baptist minister. We would always kind of scare people into going to heaven. Mm-hmm. And that was really both traumatic and kind of unhelpful. And today, what I believe really is that the opposite of faith isn't doubt, it's certainty. And so I think that a lot of these scare tactics are based off of a need for certainty. And in fact, what we know in life is that faith is the confidence that the things that we can't see will happen.
Right.
And without faith, we can't please God. And so if we're walking around 100% sure all the time, no matter what it is, we're not living in faith, I would say. And so what happened to me was that, my father is a Baptist minister. We had a small church. Everybody was white. Everybody voted the same way. Mm-hmm. Everybody believed all the same things were right and wrong down to specifications. And I felt like that when we talked about loving our neighbor as ourselves, like, it only extended to people that thought, behaved, and looked the way that we did.
Exactly.
And I read the Bible while my father preached. I was very disenchanted with that and very discouraged. And so I got to the place where I just decided I was going to throw my faith away. I went to Furman University and was on the basketball team there. And when I graduated, I said, this is all just something I don't believe in.
Right.
But before I do that, let me try to actually live in the smallest way possible that I can, the way that Jesus actually tells us to live. And the more that I prayed about that, thought about that, this became kind of like the experiment to put God to the test.
Right.
And I walked away from that experience believing firmly in the person of Jesus, even more concerned than when I started about the American church.
And I also loved in the book the way that you talk about, you had the intentions of going to graduate school, right? And then that didn't quite work out. I'll let you go into the circumstances as you wish. But how that the fact that didn't work out signified a greater purpose that God had for your life, right? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, same thing goes with the fear. It's like once one chapter closes, the next chapter of fear opens. Once one chapter of rejection closes, the next chapter opens. And so, I just applied to graduate school again recently and didn't get in again. So, so I think that every time, it's important just to put it in the Lord's hands and let him open and close the doors as he sees fit. And, I was engaged last year and that didn't work out. And so, I actually ended up leaving the company that I started at the end of 2016, though I'm still an owner. So I think that being able to put things in God's hands and trusting and just being vulnerable and not always putting your best social media face on and and being able to open up your life so that others can see both the death and the resurrection when it comes, I think that's a testimony. And so, yeah, it's just part of life. I mean, Jesus himself, when he would express his beliefs to people, they would walk away.
Right.
I mean, so putting yourself out there and removing that pride is a human thing as well.
Yeah, and I just can't talk enough about how intrigued I am about the process that you must have gone through and the different folks that you interacted with while you were living among the homeless. I know you talked a little bit about Chip, right, in the book.
Yeah.
You tell a story about Chip. And, the thing about reading your interactions with Chip was just that, it seems so genuine as it pertains to some of the relationships that I've been able to be a part of with some of the folks down at the Urban Ministries. And the funny thing about Chip was that it sounded as if Chip was always in some kind of trouble, but he seemed to put up a very confident front, right? And so that was interesting. But then it was also extremely interesting that as I dug a little bit deeper, it seemed that he was always pretty unhappy with himself on the inside.
So, what I saw in Chip's life was only holding up a mirror to what I feel as internal tensions in my own life.
Oh, wow.
And I think that that's the real message in the lesson. And when Jesus says, the last will be first, the first will be last, he has an external display of weakness, but internally he is quite strong.
Right.
And then you look at how we live our lives where people put fronts up, whether it's social media or whether the size of their home or whether what's in their bank account or the inability to express emotion and cry,
right,
vulnerable with others. It's all an external portrayal of strength when really inside people are weak. And I think that Chip challenged and encouraged me, I would say, to recognize my own humanity in him.
A lot of what I struggle with in terms of my volunteer work or in terms of me gathering attention and support for the organization that I operate, a lot of the challenge is to create the feeling of humanity, right? A lot of people see homeless folks and they just think it's over there, right? They're over there and I'm over here. We're not together, right? And so it's easy for them to ignore, right? And it's also, I also battle a lot with folks that feel that homelessness is something that people bring upon themselves, right? So if you've ever done drugs or if you ever had an alcohol issue or if you ever, made a decision, maybe you should have stayed in high school. I understand that, right? But each of us has I should have, right? And we're just fortunate that whatever mistakes we made, right, or whatever our issues are, didn't lead us to as desperate situations as others, but it could have been us. And so it's hard to get people to really grasp that message sometimes. So
yeah, I think our judgments of others are always more indicative of ourselves than they are of those people that we're judging.
Exactly. Exactly.
So still learning every day.
Please be sure to go to www.grow-in-wisdom.org. There you can find the link to download this fantastic book. Also, please don't forget that we are still doing fundraising for our Mobile Meals Project. We have a vision, and we believe that is going to be a blessed initiative. You will find a link on the website where you can donate to that project as well. Thanks again. Be blessed. Bye-bye.